Hello everyone. The purpose of this video is to analyse the viability of the video game medium for adaptation into the film format. Because through many intricacies, previous video game adaptations have failed, but as video games have evolved in storytelling, the question of whether or not they will work in a film must be re-evaluated. The thesis is that game-to-film adaptations now have more potential than ever, and are projected to succeed as a result of the increase in focused narratives in video games. The aspects that adaptations used to be flawed in can now be thrived in. We've shown potential and actual examples of adaptations succeeding against all odds in said aspects. In hypothesizing and examining the genre, I will try to deduce that they will one day succeed and encapsulate what it means for an adaptation to actually succeed. This thesis has been presented on this channel to preface a video series I have wanted to produce for a long time. In this series, I will look at different video game properties in each episode and see if they would work as a film, and if so, how. What compromises would have to be made, what sacrifices, what would change in the source material's narrative in translation from game to film. In hindsight, are there any beats or lost potential that was not present in the video game? For example, the Arbiter not being in the first Halo game despite it being suggested he was there in Halo 2. That's a missed opportunity, and it could be taken advantage of in the film adaptation. Before I sink my teeth into any of these games I really want to see adapted, I need to establish what my hypothetical terms are, the parameters, the regulations and guidelines for adaptation. I sincerely believe that video game movies are going to succeed one day. In elaborating on why I think this, I'm hoping to paint a vivid picture for everyone so they can see not only how each video game adaptation would look, but also how likely they would be to succeed in general and actually come to fruition, in a genre rapidly growing and evolving into something that is more resonant, narratively fulfilling and iconic in portraying its characters. So in order to introduce you all to my trail of thought on this subject, before I start articulating on how I think specific games can work as a film, I will first detail how video games as a whole can work in the grand scheme of things. This entire video will act as an introduction to a larger, vast array of videos, if you will, instead of having to set the foundation in every episode in the series of game-to-film adaptation videos that I will create. This right here will be the sacred text, the ancient cave paintings, if you will. They'll explain why me, a 20-something Brit, thinks a way that was once absurd, but now is actually plausible. So everyone sit back, relax, or maybe play a mindless video game in the background, exercise, it's up to you. Game to film adaptations are going to succeed one day, exponentially. Here's why. Arguably, the most notorious genre in the film medium is almost irrefutably game to film adaptations. Adaptations in general, be it novels, games or board games, have a tendency to gain a negative reception and fail financially and critically. This is of course excluding the exceptional cases such as the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Silence of the Lambs, and to be more contemporary, The Hunger Games. The vast majority of book-to-film adaptations underperform at the box office and are derided by critics and fans. Today we are seeing more lackluster, tired and cynical book-to-film adaptations in the form of The Darkest Minds and Netflix's The Silence. They seem to only come to fruition to capitalise on a novel's success. This is done regardless of whether or not there is a good, discernible reason as to why a particular piece of storytelling would make a good film that's cohesive in its narrative. Yet, the shortcomings of adaptations are not always due to a creative team being devoid of any passion for a project. It is a genuinely difficult task to translate a narrative form from one medium to another, as they don't share the same intricacies, be it the typical runtime, the way in which the narrative is conveyed, logistical limitations, the conundrum of who to cast as an actor, strict budgets, the economic climate, the social climate. All these factors make for a monumental task for the cast crew writers, and I will be discussing and extrapolating on them throughout. That being said, one breed of adaptation is unique, unparalleled in its complications and narrative translation. The process of adapting a video game, a medium that provides the players with the ability to control their environment and roleplay as a character in the game's narrative. The role-playing and gameplay formula is a visceral form of escapism that is so immersive that it is not really hindered if the underlying narrative is lackluster by feature screenplay standards, such as 2016's Doom or the like. As long as the player has something to overcome and interact with, or shoot at, they are very likely to forgive a video game's downfall in plot and logic that would have been heavily scrutinised in any other medium. The interactivity is the saviour of video games in that respect, and is the foundation of what makes them great. This is why game-to-film adaptations are notorious as a genre. Of course, a video game does have to go through the usual trials and tribulations to adapt to the screen, just like any other form of adaptation, but a video game is stripped of what has always been its core function as a form of entertainment, its player interactivity. The same cannot be said for any other medium of adaptation, as all the other mediums are inherently trying to tell a story first and foremost. So when they adapt between one another, it's more natural and organic as a process. This is what has drawn me to discussing this genre, as the adaptation process of game to film is troublesome, evident by the aforementioned factors I will delve into further. Thus far, no one seems to have the perfect solution. In this video I will theorise how everything can come together, the stars can align, and game to film adaptations will be the best they can possibly be. Despite the transference of game to film being unique and often haphazard, it is by no means a novelty in the entertainment industry. As you might already know, the first theatrical release of a game licensed movie to hit the silver screen was Super Mario Bros. From 1993. Since then, they have been circulating through Hollywood for over 25 years now, and they have often proven themselves to be utterly impotent against original films, comic book adaptations and novel adaptations. Thus far, believe it or not, no video game movies have exceeded 59% on Rotten Tomatoes in 2019. And if you don't know how Rotten Tomatoes works, you have to get at least 60% or over to be considered certified as fresh. The evidence for this can be found displayed on Rotten Tomatoes' top 47 video game adaptations article, so take a look at that. So this being said, what's changed? Why will they succeed despite the genre's awful track record?
Mother, you're alive. Too bad you will die.
Video games as an art form have exponentially evolved into an experience that can deliver just as much of a narrative as a book or film can. The rich and layered storytelling in games such as The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt and Red Dead Redemption 2 makes the player's interactivity almost seem irrelevant and not completely necessary in comparison, as if the game is no longer reliant on its gameplay mechanics, but instead can excel in storytelling alone. This turn of events can put some players off of the game, and they might see it as a devolution. However, speaking in terms of storytelling and the integrity of the modern game's hypothetical film adaptation, they are evolving into material that provides the screenwriter of an adaptive screenplay with mounds of narrative beats and world building to work with. Unfortunately, this doesn't inherently make adapting games an easy task. There is still the hurdle of dealing with runtime differences and the like. Cinematic games are creating both correlation and causation to game-to-film adaptations in that they are taking steps in the right direction, evident by 2018's Tomb Raider film. It was not perfect really, or even good depending on who you ask, but it irrefutably shows potential in the steps in the right direction, thanks to the story present in the game it's based on, Tomb Raider from 2013.
What's your name?
Lara.
Surname?
Croft.
For the most part, the populace has not yet become aware of this revolution. Ergo, the genre needs to prove itself and break through the stigmas and bad connotations that makes moviegoers repulse the idea of an adaptation of their favourite video games. The relationship between a game's fan base and its film adaptations has grown either sour or estranged over the years, as the writers of the adaptations seem to have no vested interest in appeasing the fans of the material, but instead to appease producers, studios, or shareholders, or the respective studios, and in doing that, they try to appeal to everyone. This mentality has previously resulted in cookie-cutter, mass-produced and formulaic films that can only amount to anodyne experiences in Hitman, Agent 47 and Assassin's Creed. They only bear similarities with the original source material in its title and character names. The material is stripped of its soul and compassion. For video game adaptations to succeed, they need to tailor the experience to the same demographic of the video game itself. It's only logical for financial success. A decade ago, it was easy for them to hurl a game license at the silver screen to lure fans in, because back then viewers didn't know any better. But years have passed and audience members have grown smarter, more conscious and informed of what's going on behind the scenes. They are informed on the talent involved with the film. Audience members are equipped with the modern tools to be able to deduce if a film is of quality or passion, or will be. Like learning to adapt to a boss's attacks, gamers are learning which directors to be skeptical of. If a Halo film adaptation or an Overwatch film adaptation was to be announced, no one would take the sheer fact that it was an official Halo or Overwatch film with face value. The project would be surveyed under the magnifying glass that is IMDb, Twitter, Facebook and Box Office Mojo. The point is, it is much harder for studios to get away with idly creating a game-to-film adaptation today. They have to either put effort in or hire someone that will, in order to thrive, as evident by the difference in the box office numbers between these two films based on the same IP. It's almost like casual moviegoers across the world are becoming more aware of what they shouldn't spend their money on. And that's just it. Using the tools of the internet, the fan base of any given material will be outraged if a certain aspect of their beloved franchise isn't being treated with sincerity, authenticity, and faithfulness. Enter the upcoming TV show adaptation for the game series of the same name, The Witcher. The franchise has some loyal and seasoned fanatics that have indulged themselves in the books and its titular video game, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. After the adaptation was announced for the Netflix platform, the cast and confirmations followed. The character of Ciri, a young feminine adult warrior whose heritage descends from the king of the fictional land, and therefore dictates the race and social climate of the whole fictional world. That character was rumoured to have a casting call for a black minority, despite her character being of white Caucasian. This started an uproar on the internet, which was only worsened by the politics embedded in the discussion, because of the apparent forced diversity. This insinuated that the producers behind the show were treating the show like a money-making crowd pleaser, as far as the already skeptical fans of the games were concerned. It escalated to making the showrunners quit Twitter temporarily. That being said, when this was revealed to be nothing but a rumour, the real casting call was announced for the character and things calmed down, although fans still remain skeptical to this day for an abundance of reasons. All in all, this encapsulates the magnitude of the controversy and how detrimental unfaithfulness can be to a film's success. A similar scenario was the backlash over Sonic's design in the trailer for Sonic the Hedgehog from 2019. After this backlash from the internet due to the design of Sonic being unfaithful in design to his original appearance, the director of the film committed to changing the design to correct the mistakes and appease the fans of the iconic character, as they are, after all, the film's immediate demographic. Until recent, studios actually listening to the fans to this extent was unheard of, but it's becoming clear that they have no other choice than to change their attitude and approach to video game adaptations.
Morning, boys!
Up there! In that tower!
Ah, shit.
No!
Crap! Oh, that kinda hurt.
Move it out! Clap him! Flank! Flank!
Catch!
Go, go! Oh, shit! Move, move!
Nice shot!
Even if the fanbase is completely on board with the cast and crew lineup of the adaptation, and the most sought after creative minds with a prolific pedigree are attached to the project, there are still trials and tribulations even then to go through in the writing process. The nature of games makes them longer and more expansive. The typical runtime of a game's linear story mode can span over 20 hours, so naturally, the typical runtime of a contemporary feature film being 90 to 120 minutes, this of course poses a problem. It is easy for someone to assume that this problem is synonymous to adapting a novel to a film, as the length of a novel story exceeds that of a film, but it's not that simple. That is not the case. Both a novel and a film are serving the same purpose of telling the story to the audience. When it comes to adapting a video game's content to the film format, it is far more complicated. You have to determine which parts of a video game is actually a viable component to be adapted as a story beat for its adaptation. The vast majority of a lot of games' runtime is often taken up by game shenanigans of shooting and battling through countless enemies. This is not storytelling but part of the etiquette of what games are all about, the challenge. Screenwriters have often mistaken segments like this as something that should be adapted to a film, much like the distracting first-person scene in Doom 2005. Screenwriters need to determine what attributes of the interactive experience can appropriately translate to film, and what can be done about the removal of the game's core function of interactivity itself. Something needs to be done, something needs to be implemented to fill that void is left when you take away gameplay from a video game story. An excerpt from Game on Hollywood, Essays on the Intersection of Video Games and Cinema, hypothesizes that their juxtaposition between two proposed forms of interactivity can rectify the problem caused by the removal of player interactivity from video games when they translate to film. The writer proposes a new form of interactivity that can be incorporated into game-to-film movies in order to salvage the film, and as a result, salvage this entire genre from total stigmatization. This is referred to as interpretive interactivity. This entails the audience of a film interacting with the film by means of perceiving the film's narrative as it is conveyed to them, then deducing and conjuring their own insights, not through their motor functions but their cognitive functions. In a whodunit film, the watcher can perceptively analyse the story and think about who he thinks the killer is, or either alone or with his friends, making for what is essentially a multiplayer game. The crux at this point is that the omission of player interactivity in a game story won't be a detriment to its film adaptation, providing it is replaced with something substantive that utilises the film format. This is just a thought exercise that can help writers of the game to film adaptations to elicit some audience engagement from the film. There needs to be more elaborated and defined themes, messages and ideologies or philosophies that can be explored by the audience of the film and interpreted in their own unique way. Applying a theme that is either well defined or malleable in a video game isn't an absolute necessity in a video game's coherent storyline, but it will become so when it is adapted to the film format, as the audience is doing nothing but spectating the story as it unfolds. Their minds will need something to play with, something to interact with and tinker with. When watching a movie, your mind is for the most part looking for some ideological ideas to toy with, or perhaps a moral dilemma through moral ambiguity to ponder through. You can take Captain America Civil War for instance. Sure, it may be superheroes punching and shooting things, but if you're paying attention, you as an audience member should be questioning whether the Sokovia Accord should be accepted and citizens with enhanced cosmic abilities should be supervised under jurisdiction. The script clearly intends for the audience to be torn on whose philosophies to side with, and it does that well, despite their Team Iron Man, Team Cap marketing strategy. Captain America Civil War was a video game. The plot might have been far more basic on a fundamental level. It would have primarily focused on the superheroes fighting, not unlike Marvel vs. Capcom, but nonetheless, Civil War is a film, and there was a lot going on in the story. Things going on that can be interpreted in your own way. In terms of video game adaptations, given that their storylines often have a singular character in the forefront, nothing will deliver that interpretive interactivity to the audience better than the adaptation's main character. It is said that the main character of any film's storyline makes it what it is. Whether you agree with that statement or not, many films have flourished because of the screenwriter had that mentality. Movies such as American Psycho, Fight Club, Prisoners, Falling Down and Nightcrawler, they have succeeded as character studies as they delve into the psychology of the characters in the present situations they are in, or dissect how they perceive the world and their coping mechanisms for emotional trauma. The screenwriter of a game-to-film adaptation must develop and add layers to characters who are often unemotional, mute blank slates in their video game counterpart. This is due to the game's intention of allowing the player to fully roleplay as the character and make them feel like they are Master Chief from Halo Combat Evolved. On the other hand, as stated earlier, games are becoming so story-driven that typical video game tendencies such as the character being a blank slate are either abandoned or take a back seat. But to avoid implying that there are strict limitations to what games can be adapted, I will extrapolate on why even relatively stoic characters can be adapted effectively. For instance, all the screenwriters of a Halo adaptation would have to do is give Master Chief motivation and conviction. This can be beyond his loyalty to the UNSC, the fictional military force that combats foes from beyond the Earth. Master Chief, being the last superhuman augmented soldier, can feel the weight of the responsibility as he has to save the lives of everyone in the Halo ring. Not unlike Spider-Man as a prime example. He can be given companions to care about and make connections with. The game has already achieved this with the addition of Cortana, but it was never clear how Master Chief felt about his current situation, as he was mostly silent throughout the game. Experienced, seasoned writers have to be attached to the project in order to apply good dialogue to develop the characters, and that will happen. As stated before, the cynical mentality of churning out video game adaptation after video game adaptation is becoming more frowned upon and harder to get away with. Thus, adaptations are projected to improve thanks to the doors opening for passionate filmmakers, especially due to the opening of PlayStation's new movie production studio. More on that later. As games get more story-driven, they are in turn making more of an attempt to immerse the player in not only the situational environment and combative predicament they are in, but a fleshed out story with characterization, world building, morality, conflict and other philosophical attributes. However, this poses a problem that I and many others find rather distracting when the intended tone of a game's narrative clashes with the player's actions in the game. Ludonarrative dissonance absolutely needs to be respected and comprehended as a regulation and concept in order to seamlessly adapt game to film. In the game Tomb Raider 2013, which was a spiritual reboot of the franchise that redefined it as a grittier and more grounded take on Lara Croft's adventures, it suffered from the developers' negligence towards ludonarrative dissonance. This game acted as the origin story that transforms Lara Croft from a young, innocent archaeology student to a Tomb Raider who would kill anyone who would ferociously oppose her. The game portrays Lara's first kill as something that takes an emotional toll on her, and it made for a great scene for emotional impact. Yet immediately after that, Lara is killing her way through countless cannon fodder enemies like it's nobody's business. It creates this sense of disconnection that can be immersion breaking, and it often makes the characters seem like sociopaths, such as Nathan Drake in Uncharted 4, humorously quipping whilst murdering through countless enemies with firearms.
Nice shot!
Push up on him!
Crap! Think fast!
But, regardless of my inhibitions towards it, this can be forgiven in the video game medium as the player needs a challenge. The problem comes with Tomb Raider's corresponding film adaptation of the same name. Laura's first kill is executed with the same impact, but then Lara exhibits her cognitive dissonance towards the act of killing and taking lives, as she does it over and over again. Here is my proposed fix. As it can be assumed that most ruthless killers are mostly scarred by their first kill, The same can be said for Laura, hopefully. But both game and film depict her killing foes mere minutes after she's done it for the first time, and she is immediately fine with it. All it would have taken is specific direction for Alicia Vikander's emotions while she is killing people, or some just coverage shots. She needs to convey sorrow and remorse when prowling through people, instead of this over-the-top action that is more akin to the vibe of more old-fashioned realization of the Tomb Raider that the creators are trying to distance themselves from. Okay, think about this. The audience will often treat the same fault with different levels of scrutiny and suspension of disbelief depending on the format. If Laura's reactions to her situation don't quite follow, they will see it in an instance in its film realization. Now take this into account. If a character's clothing emerged from water bone dry, it would be lambasted in one medium and forgiven in the other. Guess which is which?
Well, Cortana did her best, but we never really had a chance.
A dozen Covenant superior battleships against a single Halcyon-class cruiser. With those odds, I'm content with 3, make that 4 kills. Sleep well?
No thanks to your driving, yes.
So you did miss me.
Report!
It must have been one of their boarding parties. I'd guess an antimatter charge.
Ma'am! Fire control for the main cannon is offline!
Captain, the cannon was my last offensive option.
All right then. I'm initiating Cold Protocol Article 2. We're abandoning the Autumn.
As profound as the producer's attitude regarding the adaptive game-to-film project may be, there is this inevitable hurdle to take into account, because after all, the filmmaking is a business. More often than not, a video game's publisher and the studio behind its adaptation are not one of the same. Thus, two studios operating on different business terrain have to make ends meet and collaborate to realise their vision. They need to understand how each other's business and industries work within their own right. Otherwise, a project can fall apart. Microsoft, who holds the right to the Halo IP, were unaccustomed with Hollywood's culture when it came to developing the film adaptation titled Halo from 2006. They wanted to dictate the terms concerning the shared profits from the film, despite them being newcomers to the movie business. They were only willing to relinquish the rights as long as their demands for what would be in the film were met. Given that, they had to make said demands clear, so they paid Alex Garland, the writer of 28 Days Later and the writer and director of Annihilation, they paid him $1 million to pen a script that was tailored to their expectations and fully realised the story of Halo Combat Evolved along with the game's dense mythology onto the silver screen. This script is available to see online. I did read it myself, and as a first draft goes, it was pretty solid and it could have been something pretty awesome. But unfortunately, the production fell apart when Fox and Microsoft were unable to come to an agreement. Microsoft were aiming sky high, too arbitrary and ambitious of an approach considering the Halo IP was new to the film market and had not yet gained the attention and respect of the general cinematic audience. Creative directives behind a game-to-film adaptation should be implored to take measures to prove themselves as a worthy candidate for the silver screen. Perhaps a devised piece of test footage, a short film that radiates the world, tone and setting, characters and theme of the story, or filming only the prologue, or a scene which can be used during a focus group to undertake market research. This would determine whether or not the game and film format would gel together well with this game's narrative. And I, for one, know exactly which scene I would pick to sell people and producers on the idea of the Halo Combat Evolved storyline gelling with the film format. But I'm going to save that for a future video, because that would be quite a tangent to go on, and plus there's already a remarkable example of an adaptive piece thriving against all odds. This is in the form of Deadpool from 2016. Since the highly regarded comics of Deadpool were very eccentric and violent in their tone, it was borderline impossible to convince Fox to finance this project, as the inevitable R rating it would receive, assuming the adaptation would be faithful, would have been predicted to degrade the sales and narrow the demographic down and appeal to a lesser state. which is why studios always try to sugarcoat films to a PG-13 rating at the most, especially in some action scenes in the MCU, where there should be blood but there isn't. The corridor crew's transformation of an early scene in Civil War perfectly visualizes this. Anyhow, for Deadpool, all was not lost, as the director created a piece of test footage that depicted one of the film's most action-packed, nuanced and rampant scenes. Deadpool is seen creatively hunting down armed henchmen in a high-octane chase and gunfight on the highway. This scene captured what made the comics appealing, and the creators knew this. Inexplicably, test footage was leaked online for the public to see. Some people theorised that they were leaked by them themselves to garner the buzz to assist them in convincing Fox to get it made. Whatever the truth, that test footage catapulted Deadpool in the public eye. According to Ryan Reynolds, within 24 hours of the leak, they had a green light. The fan base relished what they saw. Then once the film was a success, it changed the studio's perception on R-rated projects entirely, hence the emergence of Logan. Then after Fox had 2 widely successful R-rated films under their belt, it influenced the entire film industry concerning R-rated films, and it spawned a plethora of even more. Case in point, test footage or a project using the game's universe can go a long way in riding the terrain and seeing what will work on the silver screen. I personally think Halo would absolutely work as a film. An argument can be made against that, but in any case, because of Microsoft's overconfidence in Halo's viability as a blockbuster, and their refusal to take the aforementioned measures, we will most likely never know. But in the light of the Deadpool test footage, more studios will take this action. After all, Halo has found its green light with the Showtime TV show adaptation, so let's hope that works out. Whilst the steady incline of cinematic storytelling in video games does provide the screenwriter of a game-to-film adaptation with more contextual narrative to work with, it is not necessarily an absolute must to be able to effectively translate a game to film. Yes, if the suits are telling the screenwriters to just make a Tetris game because it's popular, and not because they genuinely think it would make for a good story, then that is passionless on their behalf. Quoted from Kotaku, "It's a video game with no characters, story, antagonistic action or subtext, so of course they're going to make a movie out of it." This does ring true, and I can recognise the frustration in this mentality. But here's the thing, screenwriters, especially if they are experienced in penning adapted screenplays, they can often find things to work from in a game that has no narrative whatsoever. And whilst there may not be a perfect example of this for video game adaptations, there are plenty in different forms of adaptation. In the essay Managing the Real, reading SimCity, the writer's thesis indicates that there can be a narrative found in any game, so he exemplifies the most unlikely subject, SimCity. The writer cross-references a book called Robin Crusoe, which recently got a TV show adaptation of the same name on Amazon Video. This depicts a character shipwrecked and stranded on a desolate island. He has a task that his survival depends on, similar to that of a player in a SimCity game. Whereas in SimCity, it is about the sustenance of your economy and society, of a city that you built from a clean slate. In principle, they both share a similar narrative of making something from nothing. This was an intriguing hypothesis, but I'm going to look at an adaptive screenplay that does not translate games, nor books or comics, but toys, the Lego Movie. When it was announced there was going to be a movie based on Lego, the reaction was sour and quite ridiculing due to the precedent set by other films based on toys, such as Max Steel and Battleship. Movies like these have always made most moviegoers recoil at the idea. Nonetheless, upon its release, it was critically praised by all and was seen as an instant success. The screenwriter identified the underlying themes playing with Lego and why it resonated with us as kids and why it still brings us nostalgia as adults. From the conflict between making whatever you want with Lego or abiding to the instructions representative of creative freedom, to the corporate side of creativity in the form of the game's villain, unsubtly named Lord Business. The screenwriter found a narrative through a toy by understanding why LEGO is so prevalent and resonating with people to this day. It is innovative writing, and though it might not be easy, anything has potential to be the basis of a great story in our day-to-day lives in a casual conversation. Yes, it still stands that games with a great preconceived narrative will adapt more fluidly into the film format, but projects like the LEGO Movie proves that it is not a prerequisite or a constraint. On the other hand, it must be remembered that movies based on minimal concepts are still at risk of utterly failing and being lambasted, such as the Emoji Movie. So, concerning whether the Tetris film will work narratively, time will tell. Do I think Tetris is a solid foundation for a film adaptation? No. I think it will result in a cringeworthy forced theme of the pressures of fitting in. I think the Emoji Movie made the mistake of taking the emojis literally and trying to make them a running theme, instead of focusing on the social aspects of why we use them. I'm not sure, but then again, neither were people about LEGO until the LEGO Movie was released. Okay, bear with me on this one here. As I talked before about exploring the character's inner psyche with the prime example of Falling Down, what I will now do is explain how the most surface value, mindless, violent game in the form of GTA Online, not GTA's story, just the online mode, in which the player is free to break laws, attack innocent people and rob people for no discernible reasons. The player is given a sandbox and the means to go on a rampage. I have enjoyed my fair share of GTA Online. I only go to it for some gameplay moments that are mostly superficial and humorous. When I'm pedaling my car down busy streets and drive-by shooting cop cars and petrol tanks, it is fun, but it lacks any meaning other than maybe gaining XP in a game, or watching cars flip and NPCs ragdolling around. Now, let's get hypothetical here. Imagine if there was another video game from the early 90s. It's a top-down game. You play a disgruntled office worker who has had enough and goes on a rampage. Let's say the more property damage you cause, the higher the score. And that's it. That's the game. It is no more than a surface-level arcade game that might be played for around 20 minutes at a time. But beyond that, it's just a video game without a base storyline. Then a screenwriter is assigned with the task of adapting this video game into a feature film. What does he do? Well, perhaps he develops a film that shares many similarities with that of Falling Down. If you haven't seen Falling Down, it was released in 1993 and stars Michael Douglas as an unemployed defence worker frustrated with a variety of flaws in society that he sees embedded within. Now, from face value, you could explain Falling Down as a guy merely going on a rampage around town, but there is far more undertones that delve into societal issues, both minor and major. Everything from not being able to order breakfast seconds after the fast food restaurant's arbitrary thresholds, to prejudices against minorities and the low-class citizens, not to mention neo-Nazism. Falling Down does actually have an underlying plot as well. As the anti-hero he is, his antagonist is the detective Prendergast. As Michael Douglas leaves a trail of collateral damage behind him, Prendergast is on the trail and it leads him to the same place Defense has been heading to since the start of the film. From the start of the film he is stuck in traffic, annoyed by the congestion of vehicles. He ditches his car and sets course on foot to his ex-wife and estranged child. His goal is to reunite with his ex-wife despite the restraining order against him. The film delivers some method to his madness, the madness that is the sole element of the film's hypothetical video game counterpart. There's an ingrained reason why he's doing what he's doing, going where he's going and shooting what he's shooting. He's not doing it for XP or unlocks as a player's puppet, but as a character in his own right, with personal grudges, convictions and ideologies. Falling Down does a great job of making random chaos seem orderly and plotted. If you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend it. As the thesis of this video is projecting the game to film genre to one day succeed, it is important to define what success looks like for an adaptation of original source material. There may be no better way to epitomise this other than the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, a renowned series of movies that does not only act as a blockbuster franchise, but tells an expansive story spanning over 22 movies over 11 years thus far, making for what is commonly referred to as an extremely expensive TV show. Quoted from Vanity Fair, the Marvel Universe is leaning on the kind of complex storytelling that has defined the current era of peak TV. The MCU has overcome the aforementioned hurdles of adapting from one medium to another, and the fans have always instantly recognised callbacks and references from one franchise installment to another, similar to that of a TV show or comic book. Just like game to film, comic to screen poses the problem of pacing in time frames. Marvel Comics storylines are segmented into issues which are combined into volumes. The Marvel's Civil War storyline consists of 7 issues limited to a series. A variety of other tie-in books published by Marvel and Civil War 2 that brought the Avengers head-to-head once again with clashing ideologies. This storyline vastly exceeds what could be depicted in the film's runtime, so when it was adapted in 2016 as Captain America Civil War, the writers had to decide what would work in the film format. Because Hollywood is a very different ecosystem to the comic industry, it became a necessity for Marvel Studios to sell the movie licensing of Spider-Man, X-Men and the Fantastic Four to Sony and Fox respectively, as they had a rocky beginning as a studio, not to mention eventually being acquired by Disney. This meant that in adapting the ensemble crossover storylines in Avengers Assemble and Avengers Age of Ultron, Marvel Studios were restricted to the characters they still had the rights to at the time. Therefore they had to write around that limitation, and they managed to do so efficiently. There was not an apparent empty void in the film's adaptation, where Spider-Man and X-Men used to be in their former interpretation in the original source material, as the comic books are only limited to the writer's and artist's imagination with pen to paper. There is a sense of creative freedom of being able to depict whatever you want with no budgetary constraints or concerns. The Marvel comics exhibit some of the most bombastic, explosive set pieces happening everywhere from uptown New York to the far reaches of the cosmos in the fictional realm of Thor Odin's mythological homeworld Asgard. Gargantuan battles involving dozens of recognisable characters all on the page at once. Efficient writing is not the only thing Marvel Studios had to perfect. They had to bring all these action scenes to the screen, which is easier said than done. Casting the characters with the right roles, figuring out the terms of the actors' contracts, and finally scheduling when and where all these actors can be on set at once. In the circumstance of schedules actually conflicting, they may have even had to film each of the actors' scenes on different days, despite their characters being in the same scene and making it seem seamless through CGI techniques. Not to mention that said cast members needed to be selected with care and thought by the casting directors, as the long-time fans will either rejoice or recoil at the choice of the actor to assume the role of their favourite superheroes or villains. Yet Marvel Studios have overcome the hurdle of budgetary constraints and the conundrum of casting. They started small, built their way up technically and narratively by establishing characters in Iron Man, Captain America, the First Avenger, The Incredible Hulk and Thor, with excellent casting. Since then, as of recent, before we know it, it has all crescendoed into a stupendous battle in the culmination film Avengers Endgame, depicting a battle that reminded seasoned fans of the awesome fights in the comic book panels. In all these factors, Marvel Studios has since overcome the obstacles and struggled through the trials and tribulations of throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. The payoff of putting the work in resulted in the film adaptations extending their demographic to a wider mainstream audience to an extent that Most fans haven't, and don't need to have, experienced the original source material. It is no longer a prerequisite to be able to invest and understand the stories being told through the new medium that the story has been translated to. That is what success means for an adaptation, when you not only capture the interest of fans of the material, but moviegoers across the globe. Starting from 2018, the improvements and advancements in the video game adaptation genre can be credited to Tomb Raider and, surprisingly, Rampage. Tomb Raider did well to stay true to the video game storyline and cutting most of the game shenanigans out of the plot. It managed to focus on the character more and Laura's struggle for most of the film, yet it still suffered from awkwardly shoehorning in video game components when the plot didn't call for it. But the general audience's attention span did sustain through it. Given that, it is clear that the studio scoured the industry for professionals who were talented in their respective field, but also knew a decent amount about the lore of Tomb Raider, and had, actually played the game. This might seem like a given today, but it never used to be. In the past, directors have helmed video game movie adaptations without knowing the source material beyond its title and the synopsis on the back of the box, along with some visual cues to hype up the fans for the trailer. The director of Tomb Raider clearly had some level of passion for the Tomb Raider video games, and did some research to fully respect and understand why Tomb Raider narratively resonated with players in the first place, at least in the case of 2013's Tomb Raider. Rampage, starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, is by no means a masterclass in adaptation, and it still comes across as mindless schlock for the most part, but writers at least try to make us care about the relationship between The Rock and George, like the gargantuan albino gorilla. The realistic CGI available today enables filmmakers to make the most bombastic fantasy elements in video games look at least semi-believable in their film adaptation counterparts. For that matter, the vast majority of video games movies have benefited from immersive visual effects over the decades, negating the problem of budgetary constraints and unauthentic CGI, and therefore leaving us to crack down on the singular issue at hand, the core writing aspects of these adaptations, and how we can prevent them from failing. On the opposite side of the spectrum, the antithesis of this is epitomised by an array of terrible game-to-film adaptations that could arguably have caused the stigmatisation of this entire genre. It's extremely hard to cover this topic without the mention of Huey Ball, a director of many cheaply made game-to-film adaptations notorious for constantly buying the rights to video game IPs and then making awful films based off of them. These consist of Far Cry, Alone in the Dark, Blood Rain, and In the Name of the King. As he stands today, he is a bit of a hack director because of his attitude towards adaptations, at least that's his reputation. He took advantage of German tax credits in order to still make money back from the constant box office bombs of his films, and abused the system. He could easily be held responsible for why video game adaptations are now seen as something that should only be dumb schlock and nothing more, reinforcing old-fashioned critics' egregious mentality of believing video games are not art. In this genre's past, the adaptations have also suffered from multiple producers meddling with the director's and writer's artistic vision in order to appeal to everyone, which results in appeasing no one, as I've said before. On the flip side, a film is not deemed as a failure if it doesn't please all of the game's fans. As long as a film is good and coherent, as long as there is a focus on what made the original game's narrative and soul content unique in the first place, they will have a heavy hitter on their hands. It's not really a problem if the film doesn't please everyone, every single person in that fan base, because some people in game's fan base will be disgruntled if a tiny minute detail isn't correct and doesn't correspond with the video game. providing that the screenwriters do not totally rely on the audience knowing the entirety of the lore and avoid injecting too much of the research and backstory of the fictional world into the film, effectively bloating it and distracting the audience from the core of the plot. The general response elicited should be positive because all of the factors would result in a coherent and cohesive story if they avoid doing that. This is similar, strikingly similar, to the reason Halo 5 Guardian's story just doesn't work on any level. The writers operated on a naive pretense that all of the players would have read all the extended universe novels, when the vast majority of us hadn't. This was more or less captured with Mortal Kombat, the film, but then it was utterly blundered with the sequel Mortal Kombat Annihilation. Ultimately, the writers can get too excited and mistake all of the video game's lore for work that has already been done for them. The act of adapting a story from one medium to another is really no different to a novel or comic book, so it's odd that writers seemingly think implementing some meaningless visual that the fans will be familiar with equals good craft in filmmaking. Sam Raimi, the director of the trilogy of Spider-Man films starring Tobey Maguire, definitely had a clear vision for what he wanted to do for Spider-Man, not unlike the clear, nuanced vision he had for his iconic Evil Dead films. Looking back at the Spider-Man trilogy, it seems like a perfect combination of the studio being flexible with the director and allowing him space to experiment and be creative with his craft, and the director having knowledge and ideas concerning where to take the character and what the necessary changes and stipulations will be. Spider-Man 1 and 2 was all smooth sailing, and those two films will always go down in history as the pioneers of the successful superhero adaptation genre and that business model. But when it came to developing the story for Spider-Man 3, the studio changed their tone and forced him to incorporate Venom into the film unnaturally. It acted as a great detriment to the film, as there wasn't any valuable focus for any of the three villains. Sam Raimi's plan was to persevere and take his time, much like the MCU did. He was planning to have Venom in Spider-Man 4 instead, but Sony got impatient. Sony, as a film studio they are, they saw the box office potential in the film franchise, and as a corporation they assumed the role as director, and they tried to put together a narrative as the jumbled confusion of producers and CEOs they are. Studios are not directors. Directors are directors. The same fiasco and charade has been happening with game-to-film adaptations for many years now. It is a major reason why they fail. The studio sees box office potential in a video game IP, but not narrative potential. The director or writer may see a narrative potential, so let them lead the complex design of the story. It is a major reason why they fail, game-to-film adaptations, and it baffles me how studio interference can taint a film so many times and no one seems to learn from the previous mistakes. Hence we still get studio interference disasters to this day. The Spider-Man trilogy is something to learn from and reflect from. When a studio is approaching the video game movie genre, they need to remember how Spider-Man 1 and 2 succeeded and Spider-Man 3 failed, paling in comparison. They should remember to give flexibility to the director and make the audience feel like they are watching a director's vision. Audience members can see straight through studio interference and political agendas. They can see them from a mile away, with the aforementioned tools of the internet. So, to the studios behind the upcoming Tetris film, if you're really going to go forward with it, definitely hire someone and let them do their thing and find narrative potential in that video game. Let them do what they're paid to do, what their livelihood represents, what they're good at, what their profession is, what they excel in. Let them prove me wrong, for I, and probably many others, vehemently doubt you can make a successive, story-driven, thematic, worthwhile film out of Tetris. And if anything is going to prove me wrong, it's not going to be a high scale budget similar to money that was thrown at the Emoji Movie to make it look flashy and vibrant and colourful. If anything's going to prove me wrong, it'll be a creative mind with ideas. In light of this revelation of studios changing their attitude towards the video game adaptation as a business model, recently PlayStation have opened a new film and television production studio in order to produce projects in-house rather than outsourcing their intellectual property to other studios. This is great news for video game adaptations, with Sony PlayStation in complete creative control over who directs their films. The projects should appear closer to home for devoted fans of their video games. PlayStation Productions say they have more than 100 game titles to choose from, but they didn't specify which games are confirmed to get their film adaptations as of yet. Although, as we all know, The Last of Us and Uncharted has been slated to get a film adaptation for years now, with Neil Druckmann, the writer of The Last of Us, penning the script for its film adaptation. They also go on to say that they have been inspired by what Marvel has achieved with the MCU. As I stated before, Marvel Studios has shown that the sky is the limit for executing film adaptations and balancing the mix of familiar and new. However, I doubt they will strive to mimic Marvel's cinematic universe, but instead just follow in their footsteps when systematically adapting a video game story to the silver screen. Not only does this approach make creative integrity more of a likelihood, but this will in turn avoid the issues of disagreements between studios, as movie studios were trying to negotiate the profit margin terms with Microsoft, and it was borderline hopeless. But now, in PlayStation Productions' case, under the roof that is Sony, the dealership between Sony and PlayStation should be smooth and fluent, as Sony does own them all after all. The competition between PlayStation and Xbox seems to be spreading to the film industry as well, as PlayStation Productions are still faced with their competitors in the form of upcoming Gears of War films and Showtime TV series Halo. I really hope it ends up being worth it, that existing. In conjunction, game-to-film adaptations are projected to become stellar, not exclusively because video games as an art form are evolving into a medium that is more compatible with the film formula than ever, but also because it is in every studio's best interest to ensure that the adaptation is great and faithful. There is now this overwhelming pressure to not let the cruel intentions of cynical producers dictate a film's quality, but to invest time, effort and thought into who to hire as a director and who to pen the script. This proposed revolution of the game-to-film genre is still in its early days, hence why the two most notable upcoming game-to-film adaptations are Monster Hunter and Sonic the Hedgehog, and they're being scrutinised and often ridiculed. They're not getting very good press at all, which means they're not going to get away with it this time. The public is well informed on the fact that a notorious director is behind Monster Hunter, and the people who aren't informed will eventually be, thanks to the ever-growing community of film reviewers and commentators on YouTube, with more failures to learn from and reflect from throughout the years. Come more incentives for the big studios to attach respected names to a big project, and more ways in which you can inventively bring a game to the silver screen. From being inspired by the great adaptations that did the impossible, the future for video game adaptations is looking bright, and we will one day have one that gets at least 60% on Rotten Tomatoes, an aggregate scoring system that many people use to determine whether they are going to pay to watch a film and endorse it. Thank you very much for watching this video, especially if you've stuck around for the entire thing. By the very nature of this topic, my views may change and be distorted by a turn of events. In that event, I would make an update video covering any changes of heart I may or may not have. But for now, I thank you for sticking around and hearing me out. As always, be sure to comment down below if you disagree with me or any of these subject matters. If you think I'm overly optimistic, naive, what have you. I enjoy producing these topical videos, but nothing beats a good discussion person to person. If you enjoyed this form of content, then keep an eye out for the first episode in this series. I trust you that you'll probably be able to guesstimate what video game is going to be the first episode I will be covering. As I mentioned that particular franchise constantly, incessantly throughout the video as a frame of reference. Also, look out for any other videos I make here and there. If you have reached the end of this video, I don't see why you wouldn't want to see everything else on here, on this hell of a channel, you know. I've been Graphical, see you next time. But instead just following their footsteps when systematically adaptationing. Well, that's a word that I just made up and now it exists. Recently, PlayStation have opened a new film and television division. That rhymes. To study and produce projects in-house rather than outsourcing. I can't not laugh.